All the best dreams have quests, and that's what we'll paint in this scene, our quest to retrieve the mysterious glowing ball of light from deep inside the dream world. We'll start off with the background, and like in the portal, we'll be painting a mottled mixture of greens and blues. Use your larger brush for this, and you'll need Prussian blue, phthalo green or viridian, primary yellow and white. And you'll add different mixtures of these all over the background. You don't need to worry about the very bottom of the page. I like to make the edges a little darker, so more Prussian blue and phthalo green here. And then in the center we can mix in some white, some yellow, some white and yellow. There are no wrong colors here. This background will look beautiful no matter where you add each color. You can soften the colours together as you go. I recommend this if you are not working on cotton paper or if you're having issues with the surface drying quickly. Or if you're working on a cotton page, you can add the colours in rough blobs and then come back and blur them all together like I've done here. The less moisture you have on your brush, the less the paint will move. So if you're having difficulty getting the colours to blend, try a slightly damper brush. And if the paint is moving too much and is difficult to control, try drying some of the moisture out of your brush. If you encounter a thin spot or a bit that has dried, just add a bit more paint and blend it in with the same rough overlapping strokes. Over the top of the background, we're going to add the main silhouettes, and we'll begin with some foliage around the top of the page. This should be a colour that's just a little darker than the page where you're adding it. So mine here is Prussian blue, phthalo green and a little white. That white is going to give the colour a cloudiness that lets it become more part of the background rather than standing out so much. Use a pointy brush to stamp some leaf shapes, and then fill in roughly behind this all the way to the edge of the page. I've added this to the upper right and a little to the left side. Now for our main silhouette, and this we want to be dark and bold. This is Prussian blue and phthalo green. You're going to want to make sure you have a colour that's mixed with no white added. That's how you're going to get those lovely, rich, dark tones. You can use your angled shader or other large flat brush to make a nice big rocky shape that extends up into the centre of the page. Fill in all the bare white page underneath, and you can even add a few lumpy rocks that lean in from the sides further up. With our main shapes in place, we'll begin to bring the scene to life with a few smaller silhouettes. Switch to a smaller brush that you're comfortable with for painting plant shapes. A small round or a liner brush will work best for this. And using the same dark colour, let's add some little details. I've added a few mushrooms, a fern or two, some grasses and some vines. Feel free to add other shapes if you prefer, or more plants. In the background we have all of these lovely greens, and we can even have a few things disappearing off into the gloom. I've mixed a pale greyish blue from Prussian blue, a little phthalo green and white to add a few larger leaves emerging from the background. I also added a sprinkle of foliage hanging from above and a little fern leaning in. These are subtle details and we don't need many to just add that little bit of extra interest. Over the top of the leaves, add another little plant in the dark blue, just to push those paler leaves back into the distance. For this main blocky shape here, we're going to turn it into mossy steps that climb upwards towards where we'll add our ball of mysterious light. But we're going to do it in a simple way that doesn't require us to know how to draw steps or rocks or anything complicated. We're going to imply those details with simple brush marks. First, let's add our steps. For this, we'll need the dark background colour, but with a little white added. For our steps to be visible, they would be catching the light. So that's what we'll show with a series of simple horizontal marks that curve down towards this dark area at the bottom. As you do this, your paint will run out on your brush, making a weaker and weaker mark. And this is exactly what we want. Lighter steps at the top and then darker as you move into the shadows at the bottom. Around this, we'll use our easy moss technique to give the ground here some structure. Use phthalo green or viridian with a little yellow added, but no extra water. We want this to be a really dry mixture. Grab a little of this colour in the end of a filbert brush and roughly begin to pick out the levels of the steps. We want this to look nice and irregular and natural, so avoid anything that looks too tidy or level. And try not to create stripes of moss at the level of each step. The great thing is that this first mixture is kind of dark and not super visible, but it will help you get a feel for the overall structure that you're forming. And then if you get bits that you don't like, you can blend these in or add a little of the dark colour over the top to erase them. But really, this can be super messy, so don't be afraid to let loose a little. Add some of this green to the rocky outcrops up the sides of the page too. As you get more comfortable with how it's looking, add some more yellow to your green mixture to brighten it. Concentrate this colour on the upper edges of the mossy clumps, using the rounded edge of the filbert brush to make these kind of soft, pillowy shapes. A little more yellow makes the green brighter again, and this should be reserved for around the top area of the steps. Now that I have a better idea about the lighting, I'm going to brighten up the steps a little more with a pale blue and a dry brush to get some nice texture. Just a swipe of the brush for each one, starting with the top step and working down. For our spot of mysterious light, we'll paint this like we would any other glowing spot, just a bit bigger. I've grabbed my cobalt turquoise light for this. It's a nice colour that has a different feel than all of the other colours in the scene, but feel free to use whatever colour you like. Paint your nice big spot of colour and then add some white to the centre. We want to soften the white out into the colour with a damp brush. The white will need to be reapplied in the centre to boost the brightness. And here I've added a white spot to the middle, but also some little spots around this within the coloured orb. Our orb is so full of magic that bits of it are leaking out and dancing around it, and we'll show this with some little white dots. I've added these closer together at the edge of the orb and then some getting further apart as they move away. I want to make this area around the orb a little hazy, so I've painted a ring with a weak white mixture and I'm just going to blur this outwards. If you use a small brush for this, you don't have to worry about moving that paint around too much. I like this little bit of blue so much that I'm going to add it to the mushroom silhouettes, just on the sides facing the light. For this, use a small brush and add a little of the pale blue to the edges of the mushroom facing the centre of the page. Blend this away to nothing on the shadowy side. You might need to build this up in a couple of layers until it's nice and bright, or you can add some glittery spots like I've done here, just tiny white dots concentrated along the brightest edge. For the moss, let's add a few details around the very top of the steps where all the light is. For this, you want a pale, bright green mixture. This is phthalo green plus yellow and white, and we can add some tiny texture marks with a splayed liner brush. See how the brush is flattened on the palette after adding the paint, so the bristles kind of spring apart. We get these little clusters of lines that we can use to add texture. We can also go in with a fine-tipped brush to add small stalks and give the impression of a few plants. But don't fuss too long here, these are really tiny details. If you end up with marks that you don't like or don't think quite fit in, use a little dark green to cover them or blend them away. I like to add dark green with a nice stipple texture when I do this. It keeps all the marks natural looking, like they belong there. Our final step for this scene is to add a pop of contrast, and we'll do this with some little peachy plants. Mix this colour from primary red, primary yellow and white, or Winsor & Newton's flesh tint is an easy shortcut if you have it. My red had dried on my palette, and if I'm going to add more paint, it might as well be the final colour that I want. Add this colour around in little clusters of oval blobs, making these shapes larger in the foreground and smaller as they get further away up the steps. Don't forget to add some to the rocky outcrops at the sides. We're going to make these into some little funnel-shaped plants. They're inspired by these little beasties that were growing on a garden ornament that I just thought were so cool. So we want a shadow colour to make a stem and the shadow in the centre. So add a little Prussian blue and a little red to your mixture to make a dark mauve. Use a liner to add this little funnel shape under each peach blob, and then add a little dash across the top. Repeat for all of the blobs, except those in the distance that are too tiny. Around our plants, we'll add some little sparkles with white, and these can just be floating around the top of each cluster. Maybe a few of these little dots have drifted further afield, floating around in the shadows as they wait for us to complete our quest.